I've also, over the last several years, started to do a lot more podcasts and Instagram lives and all that to put this information out to consumers, because consumers really need to understand why they're told to do certain things, because when they understand the why, that creates their, the patterns of behaviors that they stick to, right? If you understand why you do something, you have a much better chance of sticking to it than you're just doing it because you're told to do it.
Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer. It is my pleasure to have Kiran Krishnan with us. Kiran is a research microbiologist and a health and wellness expert who aims to make complex information understandable to all. He's founded a number of successful health and supplement companies over the last 20 years, including co-founding and leading Microbiome Labs, the preeminent microbiome therapeutics company focused brand among healthcare professionals. He is currently a co-founder and partner in 3 other companies that aim to revolutionize wellness care. He's conducted and published several research studies in scientific journals, has published chapters in scientific textbooks and reference books, has global patents, and is a sought-after speaker on human health and the microbiome. Kiran, it's so great to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So the microbiome is a lot more important than many folks think. So what got you started into that particular research area and then developing nutraceuticals or supplements to help with the microbiome?
Yeah, for me, timing was really a significant factor in all this, right? So I was going into studying microbiology with an interest in medicine. So my angle was kind of a clinical microbiology approach. And I always had in the back of my mind, maybe I'll go into medicine as well. But I started studying microbiology and I got really interested in the research side of it, especially when it comes to clinical microbiology. Now, one issue with clinical microbiology is the focus is largely on pathogens and microbes that make you sick, right? And which is an important thing, but there's lots and lots of people that are doing that work. And so I started looking at that and going, okay, what about all the other microbes? We narrow in on this like 1% or less of microbes that make you sick. What about all the other ones? They must be doing something. And so I had a significant curiosity about the rest of the microbial world as it relates to our functionality and our health. But there was no field of study for that, right, at that time. And so a few years into my research work and trying to figure out where I wanted to focus my time, the NIH kicked off the Human Microbiome Project. And the Human Microbiome Project sought out to do just that, was to understand the microbial ecosystem in the human and understand how those microbes impacted our outcomes. And the vast majority of those microbes are non-infectious. They're not the scary ones that make you sick. And so to me, I was like, wow, that is the perfect area for me to go into. So I started really honing in on the microbiome. And of course, you realize quickly, once you hone in on the microbiome, that the largest density of microbes and the most influential microbiome is really in the gut. And so the gut became the big focus for me, right? Now, when you start thinking about the gut microbiome, even early studies on the microbiome from 15 years ago indicated that diet and what you put into your digestive system had a big impact on your gut microbiome and thereby your health outcomes. And so to me, that was kind of the natural focus was, okay, foods, fermented foods, probiotics, prebiotics, these were the things that really could move the needle in terms of how they modulate the microbiome and thereby impact health. And so I started looking at the world of probiotics. I came to find that there was a lot of nonsense in the world of probiotics. Unfortunately, there's a lot of assumptions being made, scientific leaps without a lot of good data behind it. And so I honed in on probiotics as a place where we can bring some new science, some new thinking, some new and additional evidence to really use probiotics as a therapeutic tool to help people. And to me, the area I wanted to focus in was with healthcare practitioners. So I started Microbiome Labs as a healthcare practitioner focused brand, looking at the gut and looking at probiotics. And that's kind of how everything kind of funneled in to all the work that I've done since then.
So why healthcare practitioners? Why not go direct to the consumer?
For a couple of reasons. Number one is that to get the consumer's attention is really tough. As you know, you've got a very strong background in internet understanding and marketing and SEO and all that. So when you're competing for their attention, their fleeting attention, it's a very expensive and difficult, complicated endeavor. And so to stop a consumer in their tracks online and educate them on this new concept around probiotics and why the current ones don't work and all that, it's too much of an endeavor, especially if you're not funded. Right. And we didn't have any funding for what we were doing. We were bootstrapping everything. My business partner in founding Microbiome Labs is a clinician. And so, and the funny thing about him was that he's a functional medicine practitioner that had a gut health focus around his practice. He basically addressed almost any condition that someone would walk in with through the gut, right? So he had a gut health focus, and he didn't use a single probiotic in his practice. And that was very surprising to me. I was like, for a gut health practitioner who didn't use a probiotic, there must be a significant reason. And his reason was, I've tried many of them. Most of them don't work. They don't do anything. So he used other things. He used ferments and prebiotics and other things that he had, developed a skill for, and didn't use any probiotics. So I said that is a problem that we need to address. A practitioner should have a good probiotic as in their toolkit, and he's a practitioner. So we learned how to address the problems and the gaps that he was seeing. And so for practitioners, it became easy for me to go to conferences, get on the stage, do a talk, and have an hour with them to really explain all of this, versus consumers who are really difficult to get their attention.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so if I go to a practitioner and I get a recommendation or I buy a supplement from them, like I've purchased, for example, Mega Spore-Biotic because of a recommendation from a practitioner, holistic doctor. I've also purchased Hyperbiotics is the brand, and I don't know the difference between those two. I just do what's recommended to me. How do I become a more informed consumer of these different brands and different strains, and how they correlate to different issues I might be facing, or our listener might be facing?
Yeah. My solution to that has always been twofold. Number one, it's about educating the practitioner to educate their patient, because most functional medicine, holistic practitioners will spend much more time with their patients than a regular allopath will, right? You're lucky to see the allopath for 10 minutes. Most holistic practitioners are going to sit down with you for 40 minutes even, and talk through your history and explain things to you and all that. So my goal has always been to educate the practitioner so they understand the intricacies of what is the difference between a hyperbiotic and a megaspore-biotic, right? Or what's the difference between this kind of species or genus versus this kind in terms of their mechanism, with the hope that they then educate their patients on understanding why you would take this product over this product and why use this right now versus that. So with that, I speak at, outside of the couple of years of the pandemic, I speak at around 50 to 55 conferences a year in person. And then on top of that, I do maybe another 40 webinars. So, I'm speaking to thousands of practitioners in a given year with the hope of really getting them to understand this so they explain it better. And then number two, I've also, over the last several years, started to do a lot more podcasts and Instagram lives and all that to put this information out to consumers, because consumers really need to understand why they're told to do certain things, because when they understand the why, that creates their, the patterns of behaviors that they stick to, right? If you understand why you do something, you have a much better chance of sticking to it than you're just doing it because you're told to do it, right? As adults, we brush our teeth every day because we understand why, the importance of it. As a kid, you didn't understand the importance of it, so your parents always had to fight with you to brush your teeth, right? And so that's just kind of the difference. And so for me, it's about spending as much of my time as I can being on programs like this to educate consumers, and then directing consumers to programs like this so they can understand the differences. Because to really understand the difference between a probiotics, what works, what doesn't work, what they should be looking for and all that, they need someone to explain it to them. And it's not a 30-second thing. It's going to take 10 minutes on a program like this to really make them understand.
Yeah, well, we've got the time. Why don't we take those 10 minutes right now? And also, while you're at it, can you differentiate a prebiotic from a probiotic? Because some of our listeners don't know the difference.
Yeah. So a prebiotic is really a food for the bacteria in your gut. And there's many different versions of prebiotics. Now, there's a accepted definition by the regulatory agencies for what constitutes a prebiotic. And those are typically what we call oligosaccharides, right? So oligosaccharides are these very complex carbohydrate structures that can only be metabolized by microbes. So our system cannot metabolize them at all. We can't break them down and utilize the carbon in them for energy and so on. We don't get an insulin spike and all that. They're there purely to feed the microbes in your system. So the most well-known prebiotics are things like inulin, right, from chicory root. Then there's fructo-oligosaccharides and galacto-oligosaccharides and xylo-oligosaccharides. They come from the fibrous portions of fruits. They come from resistant starches in the fibrous portions of vegetables, or in the case of xylo oligosaccharides, they come from the inner part of the corn cob, that tough kind of fibrous area. So these areas or kiwi. Kiwi has a lot of oligosaccharides in it in the fibrous middle part of it. So those components are these really complex carbohydrate structures that we can't break down. So it passes right through your small bowel, which is where we digest our food and pull nutrients in. We don't break it down. So it passes right through, and then it goes into the large bowel where there's a huge population of microbes, and certain microbes can utilize them and then produce byproducts as a result of digesting them. Now, the byproducts they produce when they digest the oligosaccharides or prebiotics is where we get the benefit, because they make really beneficial things out of it. Now, fiber is another form of prebiotics as well. And there's two different types of fiber. There's soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber are fibers that can bind water and form like a gel-like structure. Insoluble fibers don't form a gel, they don't bind water, right? Now, most of the studies on fiber, and we know that fiber is one of the most important things you can consume for the microbiome especially. Most of the studies on fiber indicate that soluble fibers are really good for you. There's some evidence that insoluble fibers are also good, but soluble fibers become some of the most important. So when you think about prebiotics, think about a category of oligosaccharide prebiotics, things like inulin, fructo-oligosaccharides, galacto-oligosaccharides. Then the second category, which is the more general category, are fibers. And within fiber, you have soluble fibers and insoluble fibers.
What are a couple of examples of soluble versus insoluble
fibers? So if you look at things like psyllium husk, right, which is a very basic fiber. You can buy buckets of psyllium husk for almost nothing. And that's the key ingredient in Metamucil, for example. And you put it in a glass of water, you can mix it and it solubilizes. That means it's a soluble fiber and you can consume it. Insoluble fibers would be things like the bran that may be on brown rice, so the outside bran that doesn't mix and doesn't bind water. Now, there's benefit to that too, because it's kind of like this roughage that moves through the system. Right. And there are some microbes that can break down insoluble fibers as well. And I think what people's goal should be is you want to try to get about 3 to 4 grams per day of prebiotic oligosaccharides. Right now, oligosaccharides are even more special than fiber because they specifically feed beneficial bacteria. Now, fiber, if you have a lot of non-beneficial bacteria in the system, some of those non-beneficial bacteria can also break down the fiber and utilize them, right? So fiber can be a little bit of a mix, but in general, it's a good thing to add into your diet. But you want to get the oligosaccharides as well. So for me, my goal on a daily basis when I'm thinking about the prebiotic fiber side of it, I try to get 3 to 4 grams of prebiotic oligosaccharides. That you need to supplement because it's really hard to ensure you're getting enough of that through food. And I want to get around 30 to 40 grams of fiber, mostly soluble fiber, and mostly through food if I can, right? So I'm eating lots of high fiber fruits, vegetables, and things like that. And it's easy to just Google, foods high in soluble fiber, and you'll find all these foods, and you can try to add as much of them in your diet. And most of those guides will tell you how many grams of soluble fiber in a serving of this food and that food. So you can kind of create a little bit of a diet plan for yourself to try to get 30, 40 grams of soluble fiber into your diet each day. So 3 to 4 grams of oligosaccharide prebiotics, 30 to 40 grams of soluble fiber. If you're doing that, you're already dramatically helping your gut microbiome. There was also a huge meta-analysis study. This is a type of study that studies lots of studies, right? And they showed for every 10 grams of fiber you add into your daily diet, you reduce your mortality by 10%, right? So fiber is one of the most powerful things you can do in order to enhance your longevity and reduce your chronic disease risk, right? So this is also, there's another study that came out of this that accentuates how important fiber is. There's a study showing that gluten intolerant people, right, who decide to go on a gluten-free diet, their mortality rates in the first year to year and a half of going gluten-free dramatically increases, right? Now that's counterintuitive because you go, wait a minute, they're not tolerant of gluten, which means gluten causes inflammation in them. And if they come off the gluten, why would their mortality rate, especially from things like heart disease and all that, increase? The reason is in North America and US especially, more than almost 90% of all fiber intake comes from wheat. And so when these individuals turn off the wheat, they fail to replace that fiber with other sources of fiber. So what they've done is they're going on a no fiber diet. And that impact of that is very dramatic, even in just a year or year and a half after starting it, right? So it doesn't mean that they have to eat gluten. What it means is you have to get fiber in some way or the other into your system, right?
And if you're juicing, you're actually removing all the fiber.
Exactly, yes. And so that causes a problem for people because they go, I'm getting my fruits and vegetables. Well, you're not actually, because you're just extracting the phytonutrients, which is great. Those are good for you, but you are missing all the fiber. That's the stuff you're throwing away, right? Now, one of the things I would do when I would juice sometimes, because it's nice and easy to juice, like with carrots, for example, right? I always use carrots in my juicing. Then the fiber that comes out of it, you take it and then you bake it and you make like chips out of it. And then you've got this delicious fiber like chips, right? So whatever the fibrous component of the juicing, if that's what you want to do, then take the fibrous portion, spread it out in a pan, brush some olive oil on it, put some salt and pepper, put it in the oven, 350 for like 15 minutes. They become crispy, eat them as chips, right? Get that fiber into your system. So that becomes really important. That's the whole prebiotic category.
Yeah.
Now,
by the way, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but Jim Carrey many years ago had this hilarious skit. It's called The Juice Weasel.
No, I have not.
I'm going to add it to the show notes for this episode. It's hilarious. Yeah.
And I'm going to look it up after we get off because I love anything Jim Carrey's ever done.
Yeah.
So,
oh my goodness.
I can imagine. I can imagine how good it is. Okay, so then.
Oh, actually, one more question before you switch into the probiotics regarding oligosaccharides. Is breast milk full of oligosaccharides for the newborn?
I'm so glad you brought that up because that's a really important indication of how important oligosaccharides are to our gut, right? So if you look at human breast milk, it's the only food we consume that's been perfected by evolution over the last millions of years. And when you look at the nutrient balance within human breast milk, you've got almost 30% of the solids in human breast milk are these oligosaccharide fibers. And the oligosaccharide fibers, the baby cannot use it for energy, right? So it doesn't help the baby from a metabolic perspective. what it does is it's there just to feed the microbiome of the baby, to establish the microbiome and diversify it and so on. And there's over 200 different oligosaccharides in human breast milk, which means that we've developed, or at least women have developed, a biological system to get these unique fibers from their diet, past their digestive tract, through their liver into their mammary glands, so it can end up in breast milk, right? That's how important it is, that the complex biology of getting some nutrient from that. And it's a complex nutrient. It's not like a mineral that can just diffuse through membranes, right? This is a complex nutrient that has to go through transport systems and all that to end up in breast milk. And that is done so specifically through the course of human evolution. That underscores how important it is. And oligosaccharides will continue to be important for the rest of your life. And I can tell you, for most people who have digestive issues, they get so scared of fiber and oligosaccharides and all that because they're so concerned about the bloating, right? And yes, in many people, if you start to add a lot of fiber into your system, it may enhance your bloating, but only a percentage of bloating is actually gas related. And it's related, and only a percentage of it is related to the wrong microbes metabolizing the fiber and producing gas. A lot of bloating that people experience is actually inflammation, and fiber will actually become the solution for that inflammation. So in some cases, you have to just slowly add in the oligosaccharides. You may not start with 3 grams or 4 grams a day. You might start with 100 milligrams. Right, you might start with a couple 100 milligrams, and then you might add 1 gram of fiber a day. And over the next few weeks, you might add 1 or half a gram of fiber a day into your diet till you can build it up and build some tolerance. But ultimately, it's that fiber, soluble fiber and oligosaccharides is what will be a key part of solving your gut issues, even though you might be really scared of it right now, right? And that's in all my years of working in the gut health space. Every time I recommend that to a group of people, a room of people, whether it's practitioners or consumers, that's one of the first things I hear is that, well, but what if you can't take fiber? What if you can't tolerate it? Well, if you can't consume fiber, the mortality studies are there, right? You know that if you can't get adequate amount of fiber, soluble fiber and oligosaccharides into your system, you're going to increase your mortality rates down the line. So you have to do it, right? So that's no doubt about that. And probiotics can be a big help in this case because probiotics can enhance your utilization of the fiber, right? So now probiotics can fall into a couple different categories. Know that most probiotics, I'd say 99% of probiotics, I've rarely seen a probiotic that actually colonizes and lives in your gut permanently. Right? That used to be the narrative in the probiotic world. That's one of the first things I saw when I got into the probiotic world, and I was like, that doesn't happen, right? The vast majority of probiotics are transient organisms. While they're there, they can affect certain things, and those effects, if they're the right organisms, can be profound. But many probiotics actually just kind of die and go through the system, and you poop them out 8 hours later, right? They're not doing a whole lot of anything. This is why my business partner, like Tom, wasn't using any probiotics at all, right? Because he saw that clinically that he was giving probiotics to people and nothing was really happening. So you need specific strains to do specific functions in the gut, right? And this whole idea of just more is better is also a significant misleading narrative in the probiotic space, because what we saw when we first got into the probiotic space was that companies were basically competing on how many species and how many CFUs they had in the product, right? You'd have company A going, we have 15 strains and 30 billion CFUs, and company B goes, our product's more powerful because we have 18 strains and 40 billion. And then we have 20 strains and 100 billion. That's all they were competing on. And there's zero science to support that more strains is better and that more billion CFUs is better, right? There's almost no research on that. And so that's just a bunch of marketing nonsense. And in fact, the more of the wrong strain you use, it could actually have a negative effect on your system. So we said, okay, we have to refine this approach on probiotics. And we have to, number one, look at what kind of bacteria actually qualifies as a probiotic, right? And what kind of features does it need to have in order to be able to use it as a probiotic? So one of the first things you have to look at is what is the accepted scientific definition of a probiotic. The accepted scientific definition is a live microorganism, when administered in adequate amounts, confers a health benefit to the host, right? So there's three key parts to this well-established scientific definition. Number one is that you're delivering a live organism, right? If it's not a live organism, we now have another definition for it, and it's called a postbiotic or a ghost probiotic. We'll tackle what that means and how that affects your system as well. But first step is it has to be a live organism. So if it can't survive in the bottle, in the capsule, sitting on the shelf, can't survive through the gastric system, it doesn't really qualify as a probiotic. Number two, when administered in adequate amounts, meaning that you have to show some sort of dose response to this probiotic. You can't just go 50 billion sounds great because my competitor's 30 billion. Well, do you have a study that shows that 50 billion actually confers a health benefit to the host? And 99.9% of probiotics on the market don't have a single study behind them, right? Mm-hmm. So you have no way of validating the second part of the definition, which is the adequate, administered in adequate amounts confers a health benefit to the host. So we said, okay, we have to create a probiotic that qualifies through all of that scientific definition. So the first thing we said is what kind of organism can naturally survive through the gastric system? Because if you're swallowing a probiotic, you've got this system that's designed to kill bacteria, starting in your mouth. And then, of course, in your stomach acid is called the gastric barrier because it kills most microbes. So we said, are there microbes that can naturally survive through the gastric barrier? And as it turns out, spore-based bacteria can naturally survive through the gastric barrier, right? They've developed this capability, this robustness to be able to be swallowed and survive through the gastric system and enter the small intestine in a viable state. So then we honed in on spore-based organisms, and we said, okay, of the spore organisms, which one of these organisms can actually function in the gut and provide a health benefit to the host? So then you have to go through and look at the sequencing, the DNA of this organism, and look at every protein and all that it produces to truly understand what this organism may do in the gut if it gets there alive. And so that's where we honed in, and we worked with experts in the spore area, and we found the right strains that could not only survive, but once it got in, has the genes to produce valuable compounds for the host, like enzymes or peptides or short-chain fatty acids, all these things that we know are really beneficial for the host. So then now we have the strain, now we have to validate it through clinical research. So then we put it through clinical studies to validate the outcomes, right? So that's what we did to create what is truly a probiotic that meets all the scientific definitions and has been shown to be beneficial to the host who's the person taking the product. So this is why we developed Megaspore and how we developed Megaspore and why within 4 or 5 years of development, it became the #1 selling probiotic in the practitioner space. You know, despite our competitors being way bigger than us and so on, and having much more money to spend on marketing, sales, and all that stuff, we just let the science do the work for us, and then the science validated it, right? So I would say that for most consumers that are listening and you're trying to figure out what is the right probiotic for me, of course, working with a practitioner really helps, someone that has some knowledge behind this, because they can help guide you, but also know that the vast majority of stuff you have on the retail shelf, or you just go on Amazon and you type in probiotics, and most of the things you see are not probiotics. They're not meeting the scientific definition. They don't have clinical trials on the finished product, and they probably don't do much of anything in your system, right? What you need to look for are probiotics that have clinical trials on the finished formula, confirming that there is a health benefit to the host, whether it's alleviating gas or reducing inflammation or improving regularity or stopping leaky gut and improving leaky gut or improving the skin, whatever it may be. There has to be some sort of clinical benefit from the finished product, and they have to have shown that through clinical research, right? Without that, you have no idea what it's doing in the system, if it's doing anything at all.
Got it. Got it. And is there testing to see how your microbiome is looking before and after you've taken the supplementation? I'm sure there are many different options out there for tests. What do you recommend?
Yeah, there's a lot of different gut tests out there, but people do have to be cautious because there's a lot of high error prone gut tests as well. Because the technology around sequencing bacteria in a massive horde of microbes has improved dramatically over the last 15 years, right? The problem is many of the current gut testing companies are still using technology from 15 years ago. So, and this is a resolution issue, right? So, for example, we all can understand cameras. Our phones now have these incredible megapixel cameras on them that provide you very high resolution photography. Just imagine the old, disposable cameras from, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and many of us were using those. The difference in resolution between those cameras and what our phone can do today is similar to the difference in resolution from what the old sequencing technology can do versus the new sequencing technology. And that gives you very different results, right? And so the only test that we've utilized was one that we developed at Microbiome Labs called BiomeFX, because it uses this new high resolution sequencing called whole genome sequencing. And it's deep whole genome sequencing. So it's very high resolution, gives you 99.9% specificity and accuracy in the testing, versus the old methodology has upwards of 80% errors in the sequencing and calling out of microbes, right? So you can be completely misled by some of these tests because you look at the results and you go, oh my God, I have pathogens all over the place. And then you might start taking all these antimicrobials all the time and damaging your system more than helping it. And in fact, lots of practitioners have been doing that, and we're doing that significantly. That's one of the things we battled against in our education, was that don't use these inaccurate tests that then alarm you that you have all these pathogens, and then you put people on 6 months of antimicrobials and it harms their gut way more than helps it. Right. And so that's something we've been fighting against. So if people really want to understand what's going on in their gut, in their microbiome, I would say first do the basics, right? And before you ever test your microbiome, and the basics are getting in adequate fiber, getting in the prebiotics, diversifying your diet, right? That's one of the most important things you can do for a healthy gut. The more diverse your diet is, the more diverse your microbiome is going to be, and the healthier you are. So you want to add in as many foods as you can into your diet, right? You don't want to have a diet where you're eating 7 things every single day, the same things. So you want to diversify your diet. You want to take a good, effective probiotic. If you're doing just these few things and you're managing stress, and I'll talk about why I mentioned stress specifically, but if you're doing your prebiotics and fiber, you're diversifying your diet, you're taking good probiotic, and you're managing stress, you're really doing the basics and fundamentals that you need for your gut. And then once you get those basics out of the way, then you test your microbiome to see what is still not improved, right? And that'll give you clues as to what else you can do to enhance your microbiome by modulating your diet or adding things to your lifestyle. So let me mention stress, and then I'll give you an example of how a good, accurate microbiome test can allow you to adjust your diet so that you're more optimized for your outcomes, right? So the reason I mentioned stress is because stress is the #1 driver of leaky gut. Antibiotics and all that have a profound effect on your gut and will drive leaky gut over time. But studies do show that stress and daily stress is the #1 driver of leaky gut. And the reason for that is every bout of stress that you experience can alter your gut microbiome a little bit. And so as you add up those bouts of stress throughout every day of every week of the year, you start to get this like mini dose of antibiotics every single day, right? And then you add to that exposure to things like Roundup and, herbicides and pesticides and antibiotic courses and all these other things that affect your gut microbiome. You start to get a profound change in your microbiome where you now have a high pathogen load, or at least low levels of keystone species. These are the organisms that help form and protect the lining of your gut. When you have low levels of those keystone species, your lining becomes leaky. Leaky gut becomes the most profound driver of chronic illness because it is the biggest source of chronic low-grade inflammation. There was a 2015 meta-analysis study done that was published in Frontiers of Immunology that looked at stress-induced leaky gut was a #1 driver of mortality and morbidity worldwide, right? So stress-induced leaky gut was a #1 killer worldwide because it's an underlying factor in most chronic diseases. So if you look at things like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancers, autoimmune conditions, all of those have an underlying driver of chronic low-grade inflammation. And the biggest source of chronic low-grade inflammation is a leaky gut. And the biggest driver of a leaky gut is stress.
And
right?
there's a test for leaky gut?
So there's not a great test for leaky gut. There's a test that you can use in research because you want to measure toxins that are leaking through the lining and ending up in circulation. The problem is many of these toxins, especially the main one that's used in research called LPS, have a very short half-life when you pull serum or blood samples out, right? So the clinician doesn't have enough time to get it to the lab to get it analyzed. In research, we can do it because if you freeze the samples to -80 Fahrenheit, you actually preserve them. And so we can pull all these samples, freeze them all at -80, and then run them all at once and get the data. So you can presume, however, that you have leaky gut. If you live in North America, if you experience stress, if you experience any sort of mood disorders, if you have any immune issues, if you have allergies, asthma, food intolerances, a little bit of eczema, you've had acne, right? Almost any of these conditions are driven by leaky gut. And in our studies that we've done that are published, 55% of healthy young individuals that have no chronic illnesses, no medical conditions that are reported at all, 55% of them have profound leaky gut, right? So if you think about adults that have 1 or 2 chronic conditions that they're dealing with, they have a little bit of obesity, they have, high resting blood sugar or A1C, all of these conditions that most American adults are dealing with, they all have profound leaky gut. So you should always presume you have leaky gut and do the things that we know help alleviate leaky gut, which is the basics I talked about, increasing diversity of your microbiome by increasing diversity of your diet, adding in soluble fiber, adding in some insoluble fiber, adding in oligosaccharides, taking good probiotic, right? Managing stress. All of these things work towards alleviating leaky gut. But also there are things that have big long-term studies that show that when you do these things, they dramatically improve your outcomes. The outcomes are likely through alleviating leaky gut and chronic low-grade inflammation, but we know these things are just good for you in general. Right?
And do you find that kids have leaky gut as well? Is that pretty common as well?
Yeah, I would say so. So when you're born, your gut is leaky to begin with, right? And that's because of the different layers and barriers of your gut haven't formed well yet. The mucosal layer, the intestinal epithelium, the tight junctions, and all that. Now, normally the leakiness should subside after about 1.5 to 2 years as you've established your microbiome. And then from that point onwards, it shouldn't be a leaky gut. But then when you look at things like the asthma rates in kids, the allergy rates in kids, right? When you look at spectrum disorders and the increased prevalence of that, when you look at obesity in kids, all of those are factors of leaky gut. So I would say that most kids probably have a profound amount of leaky gut. And especially given that most kids before the age of 4 have had at least 3 courses of antibiotics, they likely will end up with leaky gut. I mean, they're having antibiotics before their microbiome can even really establish themselves. On top of that, 33% of births are C-section. C-section kids already have a dismantled microbiome, right? Because they're not getting the full inoculum passing through the vaginal canal. And a lot of moms aren't breastfeeding regularly, right? Because, of course, they've heard from their doctors and advertising and all that formula is just as good or maybe even better than breast milk because it's got DHA and this, that, and the other, right? So they're misled thinking that formula feeding is just as good. So they may not nurse for until 10, 11, 12 months, right? So all of those confounding factors together means that yes, kids are probably experiencing significant leaky gut early on. And that's probably a big explanation for why you see increased prevalence rate of these conditions like anxiety and panic disorders in kids, asthma, allergies, and so on.
Yeah, food sensitivities are rampant in kids.
Exactly. And that's rampant, right? These are things when you and I were kids weren't there. I mean, peanut allergies and all these things, right? They weren't there. Eczema in kids wasn't so profound, but now eczema and atopic dermatitis is like affecting a huge percentage of kids. We didn't see that when we were younger. There was more resilience, right, to us that we don't have now. And I wanted to give an example of how a gut test, once you do the basics, can help you refine your approach, right? And again, the reason I say don't do a gut test until you've done the basics is because your gut may be messed up in many different ways when you do a gut test and you look at it and it may be overwhelming. You might go, oh my God, I have low diversity. I have too much of this, too little of that, and so on. And it can be overwhelming. And you might go after each of those with a different approach, which may be nonsensical and may be confusing and overwhelming, when many of those things could be alleviated just by the basics, right, that we talked about earlier. So get the basics down and then do the gut test. Now, how long does it take of doing the basics for your gut to really be changed, where you would then want to look at doing a gut test? I would say give it at least 2 to 3 months, right? So let's say you've diversified your diet or you're continuing to diversify it. You're adding in, 20, 30, 40 grams of soluble fiber. You're adding in 3-4 grams of oligosaccharides. You're doing mindfulness work and managing your stress, or you can use psychobiotics to help with stress. ZenBiome can be really powerful in helping you manage stress. You're getting outdoors more. You're getting more active. You're sleeping better. You're doing all of those basics, right? Do that for about 8 weeks. And then if you still have some issues that you're experiencing where you're like, well, this hasn't gotten better, then do a gut test, right? So do the Biome effects test. Now you look at it, for example, in some people, they tend to have very high levels of sulfate reducing bacteria in their microbiomes, right? So what does that mean? Well, that means if you eat foods that contain high sulfates, these microbes will convert the sulfates into something called hydrogen sulfide. And the problem with that is hydrogen sulfide can be very inflammatory to the bowels. Now, foods that are high in sulfates are very healthy foods. There's lots of foods like take, a sauerkraut or, mushrooms and leeks and things like that. Many of these things, or even eggs, can be high in sulfates, right? So you're diversifying your diet and you're adding these beneficial foods, and yet you may not be getting all the improvements. That may be because you have a little bit too much sulfate-reducing bacteria, which means it's creating this hydrogen sulfide, right? So that's a refinement, which then the test will also show you that here's what you do to reduce those microbes. So what you do for a short period of time is you reduce the sulfate-rich foods and you increase protein-based foods, right? Because the microbes that metabolize protein and actually produce ammonia are competitors to the sulfate-reducing bacteria. So you favor those microbes for a short period of time, so you bring down the sulfate microbes and you rebalance it, right? So you may adjust your diet a little bit for another 4 weeks or 6 weeks just to make that improvement. So those are some of the refinements you can make as you go along, but you really don't want to look at doing that until you get the basics down.
Got it. And using a test like Viome instead of Biome effects would not be great. It wouldn't be the optimal solution.
Yeah, that's I have a lot of question about that test, and lots of scientists do. If you just Google, problems with Viome, you'll see a lot of question about the science behind it, right? Because number one, they're looking at RNA versus DNA. So DNA tells you who's there, right? RNA tells you what was expressed at that moment that you grab the samples. You're not producing, your microbes aren't producing all the same RNA all the time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because a particular protein is being expressed at that time, that's the predominant protein that's expressed all the time. It's just whenever you captured that sample. And also, RNA is very unstable. It's designed to be unstable because RNA is a message from your genes to the parts of your cells that make the proteins, right? So it's sending a message, and the message is designed to have a self-destruction mode because you don't want that message to be perpetual, right? It's a short-term message. Your cell is going, hey, I need this protein. Make this for me right now. Here's the message. Here's the code of how to make the protein, and we want that code to self-destruct. So the ability to capture RNA and actually preserve it is another area of concern because the stability of RNA is really poor. DNA is incredibly stable. We know. I mean, you could take a mummy that's been mummified for 5,000 years and still pull DNA and do sequencing out of it, right? So DNA has a lot of stability. So DNA is where all the studies are in terms of microbiome sequencing. All the published work is around DNA. So that's why, to me, I'm like, I would lean on a DNA test versus an RNA test.
Got it. All right. So I know we're out of time. I have one quick question, though, before we wrap up, and that is, when do you see, as a consumer, the need for something more invasive, like a colonic or a suppository or even a fecal transplant? Like, sometimes you have to bring in the big guns.
You do, yeah. I would say if you do the basics, right, that we talked about, and then you're beyond the basics, let's say you do a gut test and you're adjusting your diet and so on, and you still have a profound issue. And I say a profound issue, I mean things like chronic diarrhea, right? You're having 2 or 3 or more, issues a day where you're having loose stool. Or you're seeing things like, what looks like blood in the stool, or you can't gain weight, or you're doing exercise and all, and you can't lose weight, right? Or you're nutrient deficient in a significant way. It's good to, once a year or so do kind of a micronutrient test, or just look at some of the basics of your liver function and all that. And if you see any of those things being significantly off, then that's when you might need to bring in some of the big guns, right? And I would say that if you're over 40 or 45, one of the important things to do is to do an endoscopy, right? To do a camera and actually do colonoscopy. Not an endoscopy will go down from the mouth. You want to do a colonoscopy up the top because you want to really visualize what's going on. That individual might have significant polyps and diverticuli and all kinds of things happening in their gut, which is why they're experiencing the conditions that they're experiencing, versus just doing a treatment. You want to visually get an understanding of what's happening. So you don't want to let things like chronic constipation go too long. I've had friends that are like, oh, I go to the bathroom once every 3 days. And I'm like, well, that's not normal, right? You need to really go and get that checked out. Now, let's say you're doing all the basics and you've added in some foundational supplements and all that stuff, and you're still experiencing that. Then you may need to go and do another deeper dive into what's happening, right? So chronic loose stool, chronic constipation, those can both be indications of bigger problems happening in the system. At the same time, if you have severe food intolerances, right? Like you can't add foods into your diet. Like you add a certain thing, you get all this Herxheimer reaction and you get weakening and you get lots of loose bowels, a rash, all that stuff. Those kind of individuals who are highly reactive to things and all that, they may have to do a deeper dive. But not surprisingly, the vast majority of issues can be improved and controlled if you do the basics, right? And the reason is those issues exist because people don't do the basics. Where we divorce ourselves from those basics pretty quickly once we get into life and living.
Yeah. You got to pay attention to those canaries in the coal mine, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if our listener or viewer wants to learn more from you, where do you recommend they go? And if they want to buy the kits to test themselves, if they want to buy supplements that you recommend, where should they go for those?
Yeah. So for me, I'm very active on Instagram, putting out as much educational information as I can. so people are empowered with knowledge to support themselves. So my Instagram handle is Kiran Biome, KIRANBIOME. If you put Kiran Krishnan in Facebook, you'll also find my profile there. So things get posted there quite a bit. If you want to listen to programs like this on many different topics as it relates to the microbiome or the gut, if you just go to YouTube and put in my name with a topic, say SIBO or bloating or whatever it may be, you'll find an interview that I've done or presentation I've done on that topic, because I've done a lot of them, and many of the hosts have kindly uploaded lots of that stuff to YouTube. So there's a lot of resources there. On the products, so Microbiome Labs products if you go to the Microbiome Labs website, you can find a practitioner in your area that carries the products. Some of the products are available on Amazon as well through a authorized supplier called Fortress Brands. And then the gut test is called BIOME-FX. The letter F and the letter X. So just look up Biome Effects. You'll find the website. You can find practitioners that you can order the test through as well on there. So those are all the resources and all that. And if you can work with a practitioner, even if it's a health coach online, to just help kind of create a program and create some milestones for you and some accountability and all of that stuff, that can be really good. Like everyone could use a coach and could use some direction. So I do recommend, if you can, look up, health coaches and things like that can help you on your journey.
And I've interviewed some of them here on the show, like Dr. Will Cole.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, Will can be fantastic. I send a lot of people to somebody called Jenny Lynn Fit. She does a lot of microbiome testing and is very familiar with the microbiome. And a lot of times if you can, and many of them don't cost much, but it's a great way of really honing in on a program and being more methodical about your health approach and having some accountability, which is always good.
Kiran, thank you so much. This was fabulous, so informational and potentially life-saving for some of our listeners. We'll see. And thank you for all you do. Like, you are out there in the world spreading the message, speaking at so many conferences. My hat's off to you for doing all those events. And listener, get the word out too, because now the importance of your microbiome and probiotics, prebiotics, and all that. So spread the word and make it a great week. We'll catch you on the next episode. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.